Well, I think it's about time we get back into these schedule preview videos that I've been doing. We did Georgia, Florida, and Oklahoma. Up today, the Texas Shorthorn. Hey, good morning. It's Uncle Lou here. Yeah, that's right. It's me, Uncle Lou, live for you on LouTube today. Hey, thanks for watching. You know, I really appreciate it also. And in addition to that as well, subscribe to this channel. I post college football videos almost every single day of the year. Sometimes they're even watchable. That's up to you. Let me know at the end of this video if you think this one was watchable or not. We're going to preview the Texas Longhorns schedule for 2021. This is something I've been doing every spring for a few years. Normally, I like to compare the previous year's schedule to the next year's schedule. Unfortunately, we're not able to do that this year, at least not in an apples-to-apples type of way, because, of course, everyone had extremely unusual schedules in 2020 because of all the different restrictions they had in place in terms of non-con games and things like that. So we're going to give it our best shot, though. We will look at the 21 schedule. Is it easy? Is it hard? Easier or harder than 2020? What about the road games? What about the non-con games? All those kinds of things. We'll do that right now. First, I hate to do this to you, Texas man. We got to look at the 2020 schedule so we have something to compare for 2021. Of course, Texas went 7-3 in 2020 in a shortened season. Of those 3 losses, obviously the TCU loss is the one you look at and go, huh? Like, you know, how did that happen? You shouldn't have lost that game. Here's the thing, though. Almost every team in America loses at least one game a year that you don't expect them to lose. Very few teams win every game they're supposed to win. Unfortunately for Tom Herman, Texas has had just about enough of losing these types of games, and that's the game probably that ended up costing Tom Herman his job. Of course, you lost to Oklahoma in one of the best games of the year. Look, when you watch a rivalry, I'm a college football fan. Yes, Georgia is my favorite team, but I'm just a huge college football fan. And we all love rivalry games. I watch the Texas-Oklahoma game every single year. I mean, if you're a college football fan, you're watching that game, and an all-time great. I mean, this is the game you want to see when you're watching a rivalry game. Now, if you're a Texas fan, you're not happy with it. But if you're not a Texas or an Oklahoma fan and you watched it, it was just an amazing game. An overtime game, a 4-overtime game that you ended up losing 53 to 45. That's not a bad loss. Now, I know when you're Texas, any loss to Oklahoma is a bad loss. I get that. Believe me, I understand that. As a Georgia fan, we lost to Florida last year. That wasn't technically a bad loss. Florida was a pretty good team. But anytime we lose to Florida, it's a bad loss. So I get it. You're Texas. Anytime you lose to Oklahoma, it's a bad loss. But Oklahoma was a really, really good team. Now, we didn't know that necessarily at this time because Oklahoma had lost 2 of their first 3 games, a weird start to the season for them. But they ended up being one of the best teams in America by the end of the year, period. You know, they didn't get into the playoffs because of those 2 early losses, but Oklahoma was a really, really good team. You took them to the wire there, 4 overtimes, losing 53 to 45. And then, of course, you lost another heartbreaker later in the year at home to Iowa State, who also ended up being a really, really good team. I mean, they were a top 10 team. So, you know, it's never okay to lose. I get that, believe me. But Iowa State and Oklahoma were not embarrassing losses last year. The TCU game is hard to understand what happened there. Your road games at Texas Tech, another overtime game for you. You won that one. At Oklahoma State, you won that one in overtime. Or would you have 3 overtime games? You had at Kansas State, you won that one. You had a game scheduled at Kansas at the end of the year. That one ended up being canceled. And of course, your bowl game against Colorado, you actually destroyed them, 55 to 23. I think the score of that game ended up being the Valero Alamo Bowl. You remember the Alamo? Yeah, barely. Wasn't that when Texas got beat by Mexico? I'm pretty sure it was. Shout out to Davy Crockett, though. I don't know. Your only non-con game last year, week 1, UTEP. The Big 12 did allow the one non-con game to start things off. Some other conferences didn't allow any non-con games. Big 12 did allow this one here. Several Big 12 teams played a non-con game. A couple of Big 12 teams regretted it too, also because they lost. Yeah. Anyway, but you didn't. You beat UTEP 59-3. So there you go. You ended up 7-3. Tom Herman out. Steve Sarkisian in. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about my thoughts on Steve Sarkisian because that's not the point of this video. Any coaching hire is a risk and a gamble. It's no different than the NFL draft. There's no such thing as a sure thing. There's just not. When you change coaches, there's inherently some risk involved. There's some unknown. You just don't know. A guy can be amazing at one place and struggle at another. A guy can struggle at one place and be amazing at another. In the case of Steve Sarkisian, we don't really know what he's going to do as a head coach. He had one of the most high-powered offenses in America at Alabama. That offense was loaded with 5-star NFL players. Texas recruits well, too. We'll see how this translates there in terms of going from OC to head coach and from now Alabama to Texas. Let's look at the 2021 schedule and see what it looks like for Texas. All right, here it is. Of course, Texas spring game coming up here in a couple of weeks, April 24th. The next 2 weekends are, in terms of spring football, that's the best we get here during the spring is these spring football games. A ton of games coming up this weekend, April 17th, and a ton of games coming up the following weekend, April 24th, including the orange and white game, the Texas Longhorns spring game. We've had several spring games already, Clemson, Florida State, some others. But you guys will play your spring game on April 24th. And here we go with the 2021 regular season schedule. You open things up in the non-con against the Louisiana Ragin' Cajuns. Is this a gimme win? No. You should win. You should win. But some other teams should have beat Louisiana last year from the Big 12 and didn't. So, I think Texas probably wins this game, but I don't think this is one you can be sleeping through. How about at Arkansas week 2 in the non-con? Texas taking on an SEC opponent on the road in Arkansas. Year 2 for Sam Pittman at Arkansas, a new head coach. Arkansas surprised some people last year. They were better than people thought they would be. Their record, if maybe you don't follow Arkansas that often, you just look at their record and say, well, they're terrible. Yeah, I'm not trying to convince anybody they were really, really good, but Arkansas, most people predicted Arkansas to go 0-10. I mean, they had a 10-game SEC schedule. They hadn't won an SEC game in 2 full seasons. They were just a train wreck of a program and a team. Sam Pittman had never been a head coach before. They surprised a few people. They were better than people thought, and I think most people think they will be some amount better in 2021 than they were in 2020. Enough better to beat Texas at home? We'll see. I think Texas probably be a favorite in that game and probably should win that game. But it'll be one I think that a lot of people will be interested to see. Another non-con game here, Rice. Yeah, you should win that one. And then you get into your Big 12 schedule after that. You start things off at home, week 4 of the season, Texas Tech. After that, you go on the road and play at TCU. And then you have back-to-back home games before your bye week, Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. Texas Tech is a team Texas has to beat every year. I mean, you're better than them. You recruit better than them. You have better players than them. You have better history and tradition than them. You should beat Texas Tech on any given year. Same thing with TCU. Now, there have been a few years here and there where TCU has put a pretty good team together. Their coach does a pretty good job defensively in the Big 12, at least overall, not every single year, but in general. So sometimes they put a pretty decent product on the field. You do have to play them there, your first Big 12 road game. But again, I think that's a game Texas has to win, especially when you look at their next 2. Oklahoma, of course, in the Cotton Bowl, played in Dallas, the big rivalry game there. And then at home the following week against Oklahoma State. No off week before Oklahoma, no off week after Oklahoma. That could be dangerous. You see a lot of teams, most teams really, will take what they think is their biggest game of the year or their rivalry game, and they'll try to get a bye week scheduled the week ahead of that, maybe the week after. Here you got Oklahoma scheduled between a road game at TCU and then a home game the following week against Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State's a little bit of an unknown to me. They lost a lot of talent off of last year's team. They were disappointing last year. I was high on Oklahoma State last year. They were disappointing. Maybe you blame it on the COVID or whatever the case, but I don't really know what to expect from Oklahoma State this year. So I'm going to fall back on in any given year, Texas should beat Oklahoma State. Doesn't mean you're going to beat them every single year, but the odds are in your favor, generally speaking, against Oklahoma State. Oklahoma game, you'll be an underdog there. I'm really high on Oklahoma this year, and that's not always the case. I don't know if you're new to this channel or if you've been watching along for a while. I've been very hard on Oklahoma, particularly on their defense, and the defense that Oklahoma will be putting on the field this year is not the defense that they sent to the playoffs 3 or 4 years in a row. Oklahoma is a legit national title contender this year, in my opinion. I think they could definitely make the playoffs, and if they get in, I think this is their best shot to win a playoff game of any team they've put in the playoffs during the playoff era. They're a really, really good team. Doesn't mean you can't win. Of course you can win. They were a really good team last year, and you took them to 4 overtimes and almost beat them and probably should have beat them. Of course you can beat Oklahoma. And in terms of who's going to be favored in this game, Oklahoma is most likely going to be favored in this game. You'll probably be favored in every game before that. And Oklahoma State, follow that up there. Again, I think you'll be favored in that one. Then you get your bye week. Bye week comes at a pretty good time. I know different teams and coaches have different philosophies on when or where in the schedule they want their bye week. It seems like sometime around the middle of the season is a good place to have it. Play 5 or 6 games. You're going to have some guys banged up. You're going to have some injuries, things like that. Having an off week in the middle of the season gives an opportunity for some of those guys to heal up, as opposed to having a bye week maybe in week 2, or if you have it all the way at the end of your schedule in week 11 or 12 or something, and you're having to play 9, 10, 11 games straight without a bye week. So as far as where on the schedule it falls in a pretty good place. Maybe you prefer to have it ahead of that Oklahoma game. I don't know, but it falls in a pretty good place here. Come off your bye week, you got to go on the road, back-to-back games at Baylor, at Iowa State. And I think both of these games are dangerous games. Definitely the Iowa State game. Iowa State is going to be top 10 in the preseason again. Again, that doesn't mean anything. When I say Iowa State's going to be top 10 in the preseason, it doesn't mean they're going 11-1 and beating you. And maybe they do. I don't know. I'm just we're talking about perception here in April. When you're looking at these teams in the middle of spring practices and some of these people are putting out their way too early top 10 or top 25 polls or whatever, Iowa State is getting a lot of respect heading into next season. Depending on how the season goes up to that point for both these teams, Texas could be an underdog in this game too. That's not going to be an easy game. It's not an easy place to play, all jokes aside about how you can't win at Iowa State. Well, we made that joke enough times. It is a pretty tough place to play. We'll see. I think that'll be a really good game. This is the game. Texas season may sort of hinge on this game. Because I'm going to be honest, I find it hard to see a way that you beat Oklahoma this year. Sarkisian year 1, you're replacing your QB that was there for a million years. You just got a lot of questions. Oklahoma has hardly any questions at all. When you look at them on both sides of the ball, they get most of their offense back. Their defense is going to be better than it was last year. They picked up a running back out of Tennessee in the transfer portal that kind of solves that problem for them there. I'm just going to be honest. If I had to bet $1 right now, I would bet on Oklahoma to beat you. This Iowa State game, I think you have a better chance of beating Iowa State than you do Oklahoma. And the season could hinge on this game because Texas wants to, they want to get back to national title conversation and things like that. And it starts with being able to win the conference, being able to win the Big 12. And it could be that this game at Iowa State determines who gets a rematch with Oklahoma at the end of the year in the Big 12 title game. I really believe that Oklahoma and Iowa State are probably the two best teams in the Big 12, with Texas hovering right around in there. But again, some unknowns about Texas heading into next year that you don't have at Iowa State or Oklahoma. You finish things up with 3 straight games here. Kansas at home, at West Virginia, and then home against Kansas State. Those are 3 winnable games. West Virginia impressed and surprised some people last year, particularly on defense. They ended up having a top 10 defense. For a while, they had the number 1 defense. This is very impressive to do in the Big 12. We have heard for years that the reason the Big 12 defenses always rank so bad statistically is because the offenses are so good, right? And there is some truth to that. Well, West Virginia had a top 10 defense last year, and their pass defense was unbelievable. Now, that pass defense now resides in Athens, Georgia, which is fine by me. We got their DB guy, DB coach, and a DB from there that transferred in. So, which Georgia needed desperately. I don't know how West Virginia is going to do this year compared to last year. I really haven't dug that deep into them yet. You got to travel way out there and play them, though. The longest trip you can make in the Big 12 to Morgantown. Again, a place that's not easy to play. When I look at this schedule and I see road games at Iowa State and at Morgantown for West Virginia, those are two pretty difficult places to play within the Big 12. If Texas can somehow win both those road games, I think Texas probably ends up in the Big 12 title game against Oklahoma. If they lose both of those games, I don't see any way they make it to the Big 12 title game. If they split, then we'll have to see what happens with some of these other teams. But Kansas and Kansas State, you should beat both of those teams. Kansas State seems to win a game or two every year out of nowhere type of thing. You can't drop this game. It's the last game of the season. Don't let Kansas State be the team that ruins your season. If Texas is going to fail to meet expectations, and I mean its own expectations, again, Texas is a proud program with a lot of history and tradition. They expect to be competing for Big 12 and national titles year in and year out. If you're not going to get to the Big 12 title game, let it be because you lost to Oklahoma or Iowa State. Don't let it be because you lost to Kansas State at the end of the year and that ends up knocking you out of the Big 12 title game. Don't let that happen. Find a way to win that game. Again, this isn't a prediction video. I do those later. I usually do my prediction videos starting in June. I put the schedule back up on the screen and I give you a winner and a loser for every single game and I predict an overall record. I do that for about 60 teams. It's a little too early, in my opinion, to be doing that, which is why I do this separate set of videos this time of year where we just kind of take a look at the schedule and compare it to the previous years. So compared to last year's schedule, and again, it's hard to do this because we had the weird scheduling last year, but you play Oklahoma every year. That's always going to be a difficult game. Iowa State, top 10 team. You had them at home last year. That's an advantage. This year you have them on the road. Play West Virginia on the road, at Arkansas in the non-con. Again, you're a better team than Arkansas, and no one will be surprised if you go in there and win that game. But I do think these are three fairly difficult road games at Arkansas, at Iowa State, at West Virginia. So I do think the 21 schedule is a little more difficult for Texas than the 2020 schedule was. You've got 3 non-con games instead of 1. One of those non-con games is against an SEC team, albeit the worst SEC team, but still. And then you've got those 2 difficult road games within conference at Iowa State, at West Virginia, and no bye weeks around that Oklahoma game. I mean, at TCU, home against or a neutral site against Oklahoma, and then home against Oklahoma State. That's going to be tricky. A lot of teams, you heard the expression, don't get caught looking ahead type of thing. You should beat TCU. Don't get caught looking ahead to Oklahoma, though. And then if you happen to lose to Oklahoma, don't have a hangover and allow that to carry into the following week at home against Oklahoma State. If you're going to, at TCU, Oklahoma State, you got to make it through those 3 games, only losing 1 game, that being to Oklahoma. And again, you could win them all. I'm not saying you will lose, but you can't lose 2 of them, is what I'm saying. You can't lose 2 of those games. You can't let Oklahoma beat you twice type of thing. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, there it is. There's a look at the Texas Longhorns schedule for 2021. Don't forget to tell me that I just hate Texas because they beat us in a Sugar Bowl or something 3 years ago or whatever it was. Don't forget to leave that comment a bunch of times. All this guy does is talk about Texas. Anyway, have a good morning.